The rain poured endlessly that evening, tracing silver lines down the tall windows of the Monroe family home. Stella Monroe sat at the kitchen table, the soft hum of the refrigerator blending with the rhythmic beating of raindrops outside. The house had never felt so quiet, so heavy with the kind of silence that only comes when everything is falling apart. Bills lay scattered across the table, medical invoices, loan reminders, and final notices stamped in red ink. Each one felt like a wound she didn't know how to heal. Her grandmother, the one person who had always believed in her dreams, was lying in a hospital bed across town. The doctors had said she needed an operation soon. Without it, she might not make it through the next month. Stella had applied for part-time jobs, begged for payment extensions, even sold her art supplies, but it was never enough. She had always been the girl who believed that hard work could solve anything, but this time she was beginning to lose faith. Her father, Henry Monroe, had aged almost overnight. Once a confident businessman, he now moved like a man carrying invisible chains. The failed investment he'd made a year ago had drained their savings, leaving them struggling to even afford their home. His voice had lost its steady tone, replaced by the quiet shame of a man who had tried and failed to protect his family. That evening, when he called Stella into his study, she knew something was wrong. The way he sat, hands clasped tightly, eyes fixed on the floor, made her heart ache. Across from him sat a man she had never met before but somehow recognized from the countless headlines that filled business magazines. Dante Blackwood, the name alone carried weight. CEO of Blackwood Holdings, one of the most powerful corporations in the city. Known for his ruthless intelligence and unshakable control, he was the kind of man whose every move was analyzed by the media, a man born into power and raised to wield it like a weapon. When Stella entered the room, Dante rose from his seat with quiet precision. He was tall, his presence commanding without trying. His dark suit was perfectly tailored, his tie neatly knotted, his expression unreadable. His green eyes met hers, and for a moment she felt as though he could see everything. Her fear, her exhaustion, her fragile hope. And yet he gave nothing in return. Her father cleared his throat and began to speak, his voice trembling as he explained the situation. Dante had come with an offer. He would cover all of Rosa's medical expenses, pay off the family's debts, and restore the Monroe business. But there was a condition. Stella would marry him. For a long time, the room was silent except for the sound of the rain. Stella could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. Marry him? It sounded absurd, cruel even. She looked from her father's tired eyes to Dante's calm face, searching for any sign of kindness, of humanity. Why? She finally asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Dante didn't look away. Because I need a wife, he said simply. And I don't have time for love stories. The words cut deeper than she expected. He explained it like a business transaction, as though marriage were a contract, not a vow. His father, Victor Blackwood, was forcing him to settle down to protect the family's public image. Dante needed a bride and someone respectable, quiet, and trustworthy, and Henry Monroe's daughter fit that image perfectly. In return, he would ensure her family's financial recovery. It was, in his words, a fair trade. Stella felt the walls closing in. Every dream she had ever held, finishing her architecture degree, building her own firm, designing homes that felt alive, all of it began to fade beneath the crushing weight of reality. She thought of her grandmother lying in the hospital, her frail hand gripping Stella's every time she visited. She thought of her parents, of the years they had worked to give her a future. Could she really turn away from the only solution that could save them? Could she sacrifice herself for them? That night, as she lay in her room staring at the ceiling, she realized that life sometimes demanded impossible choices. And so, she said yes. The wedding took place 3 weeks later at the Blackwood estate, a mansion that seemed to stand outside of time. It sat on the edge of the city, surrounded by high stone walls and trimmed gardens that were too perfect to be beautiful. The ceremony was small and formal, attended only by a few influential figures. To the guests, it looked like a powerful alliance between two families. To Stella, it felt like a quiet funeral for her dreams. She wore a white gown chosen by someone else, her hair styled by a stranger. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she saw a version of Stella she didn't recognize. Poised, polished, but hollow. Dante stood at the altar, his face composed and unreadable like a man fulfilling a duty. When the officiant asked him to kiss his bride, he did so with a brief, polite touch, one that carried no warmth, no promise, only finality. The first days after the wedding passed in an uncomfortable blur. The Blackwood mansion was enormous. Marble floors, chandeliers that glowed like frozen stars, and hallways that seemed to stretch endlessly. Every corner was perfect yet lifeless, as though the house itself had forgotten how to breathe. Dante left early for work each morning and returned late at night. Their conversations were brief and polite, consisting mostly of formal greetings and small exchanges at dinner. Stella spent her days wandering through empty rooms, her footsteps echoing against polished floors. She missed her grandmother, her old home, the sound of laughter that used to fill her days. The only warmth in the mansion came from Margaret, the housekeeper, a kind woman in her 60s who seemed to sense Stella's loneliness. Margaret would bring her tea in the afternoons and tell her quiet stories about the house, how it once used to be filled with music and laughter when Dante's mother was alive, how everything changed after her sudden death. "He wasn't always like this," Margaret said once, her voice soft. "He used to smile, but after she passed, he buried himself in work and never came back out." Stella listened, feeling a strange pull of empathy toward the man she barely knew. Days turned into weeks. One afternoon, while exploring the mansion, Stella found herself in the old library, a vast room lined with books that smelled faintly of dust and forgotten stories. She ran her fingers along the spines of the books until she found a small window seat tucked in the corner. It overlooked the garden, which was perfectly trimmed but strangely lifeless. Sitting there, she felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in months: imagination. She opened her sketchbook, the one she had packed without thinking, and began to draw. Not just lines or structures, but ideas. How the garden could be softened with wildflowers. How sunlight could fill the hallways. How warmth could return to the walls that had forgotten laughter. That evening, when Dante returned home earlier than usual, he found her there, seated by the window, completely absorbed in her sketches. "What are you working on?" he asked, his voice calm but curious. Startled, she looked up, unsure how to answer. "Just ideas," she said finally. "For the house." He walked closer and glanced at the sketches, his eyes scanning each page with quiet interest. "You study architecture," he said, not as a question but as a statement. She nodded. "I had to stop when everything happened." There was a pause. For the first time, she saw something flicker in his eyes. Recognition, maybe even understanding. "You're good," he said simply, and walked away. It was the first time he had complimented her, and though his tone was neutral, it stayed with her long after he left. That night, Stella couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, looking out at the distant city lights, and wondered what kind of man Dante really was beneath the mask of control. She had seen glimpses of something deeper, a shadow of pain, a quiet loneliness that mirrored her own. Maybe she thought he was not cruel by choice but by circumstance. Maybe both of them were trapped in a life they hadn't chosen. As days went by, small changes began to appear in the house. A vase of fresh flowers on the dining table, soft music playing faintly in the evenings, a hint of laughter when Margaret told her stories. Stella had begun redesigning small corners of the mansion, rearranging furniture, opening curtains to let in sunlight, planting small blooms in the garden. She didn't ask for permission. She simply did it because it made the house feel alive again. Surprisingly, Dante didn't stop her. He noticed, of course, and he noticed everything, but said nothing. Sometimes she caught him watching her from a distance, his expression unreadable. One evening during dinner, he finally spoke. "The house looks different," he said. She smiled slightly. "It feels different too." He didn't respond, but she saw the faintest curve of a smile on his lips before he looked away. It was small, but to Stella, it was everything. Then one night, everything changed. Stella woke up to the sound of thunder shaking the windows. She stepped out into the hallway and noticed a faint light coming from the library. When she entered, she found Dante sitting by the fireplace, a glass of untouched whiskey in his hand. He looked nothing like the man she saw during the day. The firelight softened his sharp features, and for the first time he seemed human, tired, vulnerable, almost broken. He glanced up when she entered but didn't speak. She hesitated, then walked closer, sitting across from him. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked softly. He shook his head. "It's the anniversary," he murmured after a pause. Of my mother's death, Stella said nothing. She simply sat there, the silence between them deep but comforting. Finally, Dante spoke again. She used to love the rain, he said. Every year she would make me promise to dance in it with her. I thought it was silly back then, but now, I'd give anything to have that moment again. His voice broke slightly and Stella felt her chest tighten. You don't have to pretend to be strong all the time, she said gently. Sometimes being human is the strongest thing you can do. For a moment, he looked at her as though seeing her for the first time. Not as a contract, not as an obligation, but as someone who understood. The fire crackled between them and the air grew heavy with emotions that neither of them could name. They didn't speak again that night, but when Stella left the room, something had shifted between them. A quiet bridge built from shared pain and fragile hope. From that night on, Dante began to change in small, subtle ways. He still worked long hours, but he started joining her for breakfast, asking her opinion on minor details of his projects, listening when she spoke about her ideas. The mansion no longer felt like a cage. It was slowly, quietly becoming a home. Stella realized that maybe this wasn't just a forced marriage after all. Maybe it was the beginning of something unexpected. Not love, not yet, but understanding. And sometimes understanding was where healing began. As she stood by the window that night watching the rain fall softly against the glass, Stella smiled for the first time in months. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time she wasn't afraid of it. The following weeks unfolded like the slow unfurling of a forgotten melody, each day carrying faint echoes of change that neither Stella nor Dante could name aloud. The Blackwood Mansion, once a monument to silence and structure, began to soften in ways that were almost imperceptible at first. Sunlight crept through the wide windows, scattering gold over polished floors that had only ever known shadow. The faint fragrance of lilies drifted through the hallways. Somewhere deep inside those endless rooms, something was beginning to stir. Something alive. Something human. Stella had always been a quiet force of nature, though she never saw herself that way. Her presence was not loud or commanding, but gentle and consistent, like rain shaping stone over time. She never tried to change Dante. She simply moved through the house with quiet purpose, restoring warmth where life had once retreated. She painted the dull gray guest room in soft cream and pale gold, filled the barren dining hall with framed sketches of places she dreamed to design one day, and placed small potted plants along the corridor windowsills. Each act was a whisper against the mansion's silence, a quiet defiance of emptiness. Dante watched it all from a distance at first, puzzled by the shifts he could neither control nor prevent. His world had always been ruled by precision, by plans and outcomes that could be measured, balanced, and managed. Stella disrupted that rhythm without even trying. She was not calculating, not strategic. She simply existed with sincerity. And that unsettled him more than any negotiation ever could. In his office, he caught himself thinking about her sketches, about how her fingers moved lightly when she drew, about the way her eyes softened when she spoke about light and design. He would shake off the thought immediately, returning to his spreadsheets and phone calls, yet it always came back. The quiet image of her in that library window seat, lost in creation, untouched by his world of power and control. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day filled with boardroom tension, Dante arrived home earlier than usual. The house was quieter than he expected, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he went looking for her. He found Stella in the garden, kneeling by the soil, her hands dirty, her hair loosely tied back. She was planting something, wildflowers, he realized, not the manicured roses his father's landscapers had preferred. "You're ruining the symmetry," he said, his tone half teasing, half genuine confusion. She looked up at him, a faint smile touching her lips. "Symmetry is beautiful," she replied, "but life doesn't grow in straight lines." He stood there for a moment, watching her as the evening light painted her face in gold. Something about her words lingered in his mind long after he returned inside. That night, Dante lay awake in his enormous bed staring at the ceiling. He thought of his late mother, her laughter echoing faintly through memory, the way she used to tell him that perfection was a prison. Back then, he never understood. Now, watching Stella bring disorder that somehow felt alive, he wondered if his mother had been right all along. Days turned into weeks, and their dynamic began to shift. Dinner conversations grew a little longer. Silences became less heavy. Stella started asking Dante about his work, not out of obligation, but genuine curiosity. "Why do you love what you do?" she asked one evening. He paused before answering. "I used to," he admitted. "When I was younger, I believed I could build something meaningful. Now it's just survival." His honesty startled even himself. Stella listened quietly, her eyes reflecting understanding rather than pity. "Maybe you just forgot what meaning looked like," she said softly. Her words stayed with him like a quiet echo that refused to fade. Over the next few days, Dante began noticing things he had long ignored. The way the city skyline glowed at sunset. The laughter of the kitchen staff when they thought he wasn't listening. The distant sound of Stella humming when she painted in the sunroom. It was as though she had opened a window inside his chest that had been sealed shut for years. One morning, Margaret mentioned that Stella had gone to visit the local community center. Curious, Dante found himself driving there later that day, under the pretense of checking on a donation his company had made months ago. What he saw surprised him. Stella was surrounded by children, showing them how to build small paper houses. Their laughter filled the air, bright and unrestrained. She knelt beside a little boy struggling to fold his paper roof correctly, and guided his hands patiently. Dante stood near the doorway unseen, his throat tightening unexpectedly. This woman, who had entered his life as part of a business transaction, was teaching him, without words, what humanity looked like. That evening, he asked her about it. She told him she had been volunteering there every Friday, helping the kids learn simple design projects. "It makes me feel useful again," she said with a small smile. "It reminds me why I loved architecture in the first place. It's not just about buildings, it's about giving people space to live and breathe." Dante nodded slowly. He didn't tell her that her words had undone something inside him that no amount of success ever could. Weeks later, Stella fell ill for the first time since the marriage. It was nothing serious, just a bad cold brought on by exhaustion and long hours in the chilly garden. But for Dante, it stirred emotions he hadn't expected. When Margaret told him Stella had refused to rest, insisting on finishing a mural she was painting for the living room, he found himself walking briskly through the halls, his pulse racing. He entered the room and saw her standing unsteadily on a ladder, brush in hand, cheeks flushed with fever. Without thinking, he took the brush from her and said firmly, "That's enough. You need to rest." She looked at him, startled by the tone, not harsh, but protective. "It's almost done," she protested weakly. "It can wait," he replied. And then softer, "You can't." For a moment, neither spoke. The air between them shifted, carrying an emotion that neither dared to name. He helped her down, guiding her gently toward the couch. When she tried to thank him, her voice broke into a cough. Dante knelt beside her, his hand lingering on the blanket he wrapped around her shoulders. "You don't have to prove yourself here," he said quietly. "Not to me, not to anyone." She looked into his eyes, and for the first time saw warmth there, fragile, uncertain but real that night. Dante stayed awake in his study, staring at the fire again, remembering how empty the house used to feel before she came. For years he had built walls around himself, walls made of logic, ambition, and control. Now those same walls were cracking, and though the thought terrified him, it also set him free. The following morning, Stella woke to find a tray of breakfast waiting for her. Tea, toast, and a small vase with freshly cut lavender. It was such a simple gesture, yet it made her chest tighten with emotion. Dante had left early for work, but there was a note in his handwriting. "You once said homes need warmth to live. Thank you for reminding me what that means." When Dante returned that evening, Stella met him at the door. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she handed him a small, neatly bound sketchbook. "What's this?" he asked. "My designs," she said. "I've been reimagining the city's old orphanage building. I think it could become a community learning space." He flipped through the pages slowly, taking in the details, the open courtyards, the children's art spaces, the natural light flowing through every hall. "It's beautiful," he murmured. "Then help me make it real," she said with quiet conviction. And that was how it began, the project that would change both of them forever. Working together brought out sides of each other they had never seen. Dante, once rigid and detached, began to show patience and curiosity. He would sit beside Stella for hours, discussing layouts, logistics, and budget. occasionally teasing her about her messy sketches. Stella, in turn, learned to see the depth behind his stoic nature, the discipline that had built his empire, the quiet pain that had shaped his silence. They argued sometimes, laughed sometimes, and more often simply worked side by side in comfortable quiet. For the first time, their marriage began to feel less like a contract and more like companionship. Yet beneath all the growth, there was still an unspoken tension, something neither dared to name. Dante knew he was changing, but he didn't yet know how to face the fear that came with it. He had been taught all his life that vulnerability was weakness, that feelings distracted men from success. But every time Stella smiled at him, every time she spoke with gentle strength, he felt that belief slipping further away. One late evening, after a long day of planning, Dante found himself standing with her on the balcony overlooking the city. The night breeze carried the scent of rain. "You've changed this place," he said quietly. "You've changed me." Stella looked at him, her eyes soft but steady. "No," she said. "You're just remembering who you were before the world told you to forget." For a moment, they simply stood there side by side, not husband and wife by contract, but two souls learning to rebuild their broken foundations. Inside the mansion, the once cold walls seemed to breathe again. In the garden, wildflowers had begun to bloom, softening the rigid lines of the stone paths. And in Dante's heart, for the first time in years, something had started to grow, a fragile hope that perhaps love wasn't weakness after all, but the most powerful kind of strength. The following months brought a rhythm that felt almost foreign to both. Stella and Dante, what had once been an arrangement, built on necessity, had quietly evolved into something neither of them had expected, in a partnership marked by understanding, mutual respect, and the kind of fragile tenderness that grows not from romance but from shared purpose. The orphanage renovation project became the center of their world. Each day they drove to the old building on the city's outskirts, a place with crumbling walls, broken windows, and faded murals that once carried the laughter of children. To anyone else it looked like a ruin. To Stella it looked like potential. And slowly Dante began to see it the same way. The work was grueling but meaningful. They faced endless obstacles, permits delayed by bureaucracy, suppliers backing out at the last minute, workers quitting halfway through. Yet Stella's determination never wavered. Whenever something went wrong, she would take a deep breath, roll up her sleeves, and find a way forward. Dante often watched her in quiet admiration, realizing how rare her kind of strength was. It wasn't loud or forceful. It was calm, enduring, built from quiet resilience. There were moments when frustration pushed him toward anger, when the habits of control and perfection returned, but Stella's steady presence always pulled him back. She had a way of reminding him, without words, that problems weren't enemies. They were just puzzles waiting to be solved. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low behind the scaffolding, Dante stood beside her, gazing at the half-finished structure. The golden light caught in the strands of her hair, and for a fleeting moment he felt a warmth he couldn't quite name. "You know," he said softly, "I used to think success was measured by how much power a person held." Stella smiled faintly, her eyes still fixed on the glowing sky. "And now?" she asked. He hesitated before answering. "Now I think it's measured by how much light you leave behind." That night, Stella returned home exhausted but content. The mansion no longer felt like a cage. It had become a refuge, a place of quiet peace. She brewed tea, set her sketchbook on the table, and wrote notes about the day's progress. When Dante walked in later, his tie loosened and his hair slightly messy, she realized how much he had changed. He still carried the weight of leadership, but his eyes were softer now, his voice less guarded. He poured himself a cup of tea and joined her, glancing at her sketches. "You're redesigning the main hall again?" he asked with a hint of amusement. She nodded. "I want the children to see the sky when they walk in. A ceiling of glass panels will let sunlight fill the space." Dante leaned back, studying her. "You always think about light," he said quietly. "Maybe because I've lived too long without it," she replied, her tone gentle but firm. But just as life began to feel steady, the past returned like a storm they didn't see coming. It started with a phone call, a short, formal message that Dante received one morning before leaving for the site. His father, Victor Blackwood, was ill and wanted to see him. Dante's relationship with his father had always been complicated. Victor had raised him with iron discipline, valuing strength over empathy, success over peace. The old man's expectations had shaped Dante into the person he was, efficient, emotionless, unbreakable. But behind that facade lay years of resentment and unspoken wounds. When Dante visited the Blackwood Manor, the atmosphere felt like stepping into a frozen memory. His father sat in a large leather chair by the window, his once sharp features softened by age. "I see your wife has made quite an impression," Victor said without preamble. "The papers are calling her the new face of compassion. Good for business, though I hope you remember this marriage began as an arrangement." Dante's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice calm. "It may have started that way," he said, "but it's become something more." Victor's expression hardened. "Feelings make men weak. Remember who you are, a Blackwood. We don't build empires on emotion." Those words followed Dante home like a shadow. That evening, he was distant, his mind replaying his father's voice. Stella noticed the change immediately. Over dinner, she asked if something was wrong, but he brushed it off with a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. For days, the silence between them grew heavier. He began spending more time at work, avoiding the quiet moments that once comforted him. Stella, though hurt, didn't confront him immediately. She understood too well that healing was never a straight line. Sometimes people had to retreat before they could move forward. The storm reached its breaking point one evening when a newspaper article landed on their doorstep. It featured a photo of Stella standing beside the orphanage plans, her smile bright, her eyes full of hope. The headline read, "From Contract to Compassion, How Stella Blackwood Redefines Purpose." The article praised her leadership and vision, but it also mentioned how Dante's father had once doubted her involvement. When Dante read it, he felt a strange mix of pride and fear. Pride for her achievements, fear that he no longer controlled the narrative of his own life. For a man who had spent years defining himself through order and predictability, that loss of control felt unbearable. That night, they argued for the first time. It wasn't shouting or cruelty, just sharp words spoken from pain. Dante accused her of not understanding how fragile his company's image was, how one misstep could ruin everything. Stella, in turn, told him that life wasn't meant to be managed like a corporation. "You're afraid of losing control," she said quietly, "but you're losing yourself instead." Her words hit harder than she intended. He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes clouded with hurt, then turned and walked out into the rain without a word. The hours that followed were heavy and long. Stella sat by the window listening to the thunder, tears blurring the city lights. For the first time since their marriage, she felt the sting of uncertainty, not just about Dante, but about herself. Had she asked for too much? Expected too soon? But even in her sorrow, she knew one truth. Love, even the quiet kind, could not bloom in fear. Dante spent the night driving through the rain, his thoughts tangled between guilt and realization. He thought of his father's voice, of Stella's kindness, of his mother's laughter, all the echoes of the people who had shaped him. Somewhere between the dark streets and the pounding rain, he began to understand that strength wasn't about control. It was about courage, the courage to let go, to feel, to trust. By dawn, he returned home soaked and exhausted. Stella was sitting in the library, still awake, her eyes red but calm. When he entered, she looked up but didn't speak. For a moment, neither did he. Then Dante crossed the room slowly, stopping a few feet away. His voice was low, raw, stripped of pride. "You were right," he said simply. "I've spent my life trying to be a man my father would respect, and in doing so, I became someone I couldn't even recognize." Stella rose quietly, her eyes softening. "It's not too late to change," she whispered. He looked at her, the weight of years dissolving in his gaze. "I don't know how," he admitted. "Then let's learn together," she said, taking his hand gently. It was the first time she had reached for him without hesitation, and for the first time he didn't pull away. From that day forward, their relationship took on new meaning. The walls that had once divided them began to crumble. Dante started visiting the orphanage even when Stella wasn't there, talking to the children, helping with supplies, even sharing stories about his own childhood. The workers were surprised to see the famously stoic businessman laughing, rolling up his sleeves carrying bricks. Stella watched him from a distance, her heart swelling with quiet pride. The grand opening of the community center arrived 3 months later. The building stood transformed, sunlight streaming through glass ceilings, laughter echoing through halls painted in bright colors, murals of dreams covering every wall. As the ribbon was cut, applause filled the air. Reporters asked Dante how he felt seeing the project complete. He looked at Stella standing beside him and said, "For the first time, I feel like I've built something that truly matters." That evening, as they stood outside watching the children play in the courtyard, the sky turned crimson with sunset. Stella leaned against the railing, her heart light. Dante stood beside her, silent for a while before finally speaking. "You've changed everything," he said softly. She turned to him, smiling faintly. "No, Dante. You just remembered who you were." The wind rustled through the wildflowers, carrying with it the faint scent of rain, a reminder of how storms, though destructive, also bring growth. The mansion that once stood as a monument to silence was now alive with laughter, music, and warmth. The world outside might still see their marriage as a contract, but within those walls, it had become something far greater, a living proof that even broken beginnings can bloom into something whole, if given the chance. The months that followed the grand opening of the community center were among the most peaceful Stella and Dante had ever known. The mansion, once a mausoleum of marble and silence, had transformed into a living, breathing home. Mornings began with sunlight filtering through open curtains instead of the cold gray that used to greet the day. Margaret filled the kitchen with the aroma of freshly baked bread and laughter that came easily now, unforced and bright. Dante, who had once lived by schedules and silence, had learned to slow down. He began taking his coffee in the garden, sometimes barefoot on the dewy grass, watching Stella tend to the wildflowers she had planted. Those flowers had become a symbol of their shared rebirth, a reminder that beauty could rise from neglect if someone cared enough to nurture, and their days had settled into a rhythm that neither had dared to hope for. Dante would spend part of his morning at the company, and the rest at the community center, helping to oversee new projects. Stella, meanwhile, continued teaching the children about art, design, and imagination. The sound of their laughter was her favorite music. In the evenings, they would cook together, often ruining half the recipes and laughing until tears ran down their faces. There were still moments of silence between them, but those silences no longer carried distance. They were comfortable, like two souls breathing in rhythm. For the first time since his mother's death, Dante began to feel truly alive. Yet, deep inside, a part of him still feared how fragile happiness could be. Life had taught him that peace was often the calm before the storm. He didn't know that the storm was already gathering, quietly, patiently, waiting for the right moment to strike. It began one crisp winter morning when Dante received a call from his lawyer. At first, the conversation sounded routine, a discussion about the company's annual review, but then the lawyer's tone shifted, becoming cautious, almost apologetic. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, "I'm afraid there's been a development. Someone has filed a complaint with the board. They're accusing you of financial misconduct tied to the community center funds." Dante froze, the words sinking like lead. "That's impossible," he said. "Every expense was accounted for." The lawyer hesitated. "The documents, they've been altered. It looks like someone inside the company is trying to frame you." The following hours passed in a blur. Meetings, phone calls, and urgent emails filled the day as Dante tried to contain the damage. By evening, the story had leaked to the media. The same newspapers that once praised him now printed headlines questioning his integrity. Blackwood scandal. Charity funds misused. Investors began to withdraw support. Employees whispered behind closed doors, and for the first time in years, Dante felt the old suffocating weight of shame. When Stella found him that night in his study, he was sitting in darkness, his face buried in his hands. She quietly turned on the lamp, bathing the room in soft amber light. "Talk to me," she said gently. His voice, when it came, was hollow. "They think I stole from the very project that gave my life meaning." He looked up at her, pain etched into every line of his face. "Maybe my father was right. Maybe emotion makes you weak." Stella stepped closer, her eyes unwavering. "No," she said firmly. "Emotion makes you human, and humanity is not weakness. We'll fix this, together." But the days that followed tested every ounce of her faith. The company's board called for an emergency meeting. Reporters camped outside the gates of their home, shouting questions, flashing cameras. Some headlines went further. suggesting that Stella herself had influenced the mismanagement for personal gain. Those lies cut deeper than she expected. She had always been strong, but facing a world that twisted goodness into guilt shook her to her core. Margaret tried to comfort her, but Stella's hands trembled as she scrolled through the accusations online. It wasn't the loss of reputation that hurt. It was knowing that the dream they had built together, the symbol of hope for so many children, was being turned into a weapon. Dante fought fiercely to protect Stella from the chaos, but the pressure was immense. Investors demanded explanations. The board considered suspending him, and even his most trusted employees began to distance themselves. Every decision he had made was now under a microscope. One night, after another grueling meeting, he came home late, exhaustion written across his face. Stella met him in the hallway, her eyes full of concern. "You can't fight this alone," she said softly. He looked at her for a long moment before shaking his head. "I can't drag you through this storm." "Then let me choose to stand in it," she replied, her voice steady. "That's what love means, Dante, not walking away when it's hard." The next morning, Stella took matters into her own hands. She returned to the community center, where construction workers, volunteers, and local families had gathered, unsure of what to believe. Standing on the small stage they had built for the children's performances, Stella spoke with the same calm conviction that had once inspired Dante himself. "You've all read the headlines," she began, her voice carrying through the hall. "But I want you to look around at these walls, these colors, these smiling faces. This place wasn't built from greed. It was built from hope. And that hope doesn't belong to the papers or the boardrooms. It belongs to you." Her words spread like wildfire across the community. Parents defended her publicly. Children made handmade signs reading, "Thank you, Blackwoods." And volunteers flooded social media with photos of their work. Within days, public sentiment began to shift. But while the world started to see the truth, Dante's internal battle only deepened. He couldn't understand why someone from his own company would betray him. The answer came unexpectedly during an audit review. One of the accountants discovered that a senior executive, a man named Richard Gale, whom Dante had mentored years ago, had been forging financial documents to cover his own embezzlement. The evidence was undeniable. When Dante confronted him, Richard's mask of loyalty crumbled. "You took everything that should have been mine," he spat. "The company, the respect, the legacy. You think people follow you because you're strong, but they follow you because they're afraid. I wanted them to see you fall." For a moment, Dante felt an old familiar anger surge inside him, the instinct to retaliate, to destroy. But then he remembered Stella's voice, calm and unwavering. "You don't have to prove yourself through power." He took a slow breath and stepped back. "You're wrong," he said quietly. "People don't follow me out of fear anymore. They follow because they believe in what we've built, and that's something you'll never understand." He turned away, leaving the man to face the consequences of his own choices. When the board cleared his name days later, Dante didn't feel triumph. He felt gratitude and humility. He had faced the storm without losing himself, and that realization was worth more than any victory. The company issued a public statement exonerating him and praising the community center's transparency. The same reporters who once doubted them now asked for interviews, but Dante declined them all. He had nothing left to prove to the world. He only wanted to return home. That evening, when he walked into the mansion, Stella was in the garden watering the flowers under the golden hue of twilight. She turned when she heard his footsteps. "It's over," he said simply. She smiled, a soft, tired, radiant smile that carried the weight of everything they had endured. "No," she corrected him gently. "It's just beginning." They stood together among the wildflowers, the scent of earth and rain lingering in the air. For the first time in years, Dante didn't feel the urge to fill the silence. He reached for her hand and she took it without hesitation. "You once told me," he said quietly, "that homes need warmth to live. I think hearts do too, and mine finally does." In the days that followed, the mansion opened its doors to the community. Children came every weekend to paint, learn, and play. Dante and Stella hosted workshops, inviting students from low-income neighborhoods to explore art, science, and design. What began as a forced union between two strangers had become a movement, a living example of compassion in action. But the greatest change was within Dante himself. He no longer measured life by profit margins or reputation. He found joy in ordinary moments. A child's laughter echoing through the halls, the warmth of Stella's smile across the breakfast table, the quiet peace of a sunrise unclouded by fear. He had finally learned what his mother had tried to teach him years ago, that perfection is an illusion, but love, in all its imperfect human messiness, is the truest form of success. And so, as winter melted into spring and wildflowers spread across the Blackwood Gardens, the world saw not a businessman and his contract bride, but two souls who had rebuilt each other from the inside out. Their journey was not about wealth or power or image. It was about redemption, forgiveness, and the courage to let light in, even when darkness seemed endless. The spring air carried the scent of blooming jasmine through the Blackwood Gardens, the same gardens that had once stood silent and lifeless but now thrived with color and song. Stella walked barefoot along the stone path, her fingers brushing the soft petals as the morning light kissed her skin. It had been nearly a year since the storm that had shaken their lives, the scandal that had nearly destroyed everything they had built. But from that storm, something extraordinary had grown, not only a deeper bond between her and Dante, but a movement that spread far beyond their mansion walls. The community center had become a symbol of renewal, a place where broken people found purpose again. Children learned not just to read or paint, but to believe in themselves. Young mothers found hope through workshops that Stella had started for single parents. Even former employees who had once left Dante's company returned, inspired by the new kind of leadership he had embraced, one built not on fear, but on trust and compassion. Each morning, Dante would drive into the city with a quiet smile, no longer to command but to collaborate. He had changed in ways no one could have predicted. The man who once hid behind sharp suits and guarded words now spent his weekends sitting cross-legged on the floor of the center, helping children assemble miniature models of houses. The media that once called him ruthless now described him as visionary. But Dante no longer cared about headlines or praise. What mattered to him was the laughter that echoed through the walls of the place he and Stella had built together, the laughter that reminded him of his mother's dream, the one he had buried long ago, to create spaces that gave people hope. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, Stella stood on the balcony overlooking the city. Dante joined her quietly, his arm brushing against hers. They watched in silence for a while, letting the moment speak for itself. "Do you ever think about how it all began?" she asked softly, her voice thoughtful. He nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Every day. I used to think life was a series of transactions, actions and rewards, but now I see it differently. It's not what we take from others that defines us. It's what we give." Stella turned to him, her eyes filled with warmth. "And what you've given, Dante, is more than money or buildings. You've given people faith again." He reached for her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. "You gave me that first," he said quietly. "You showed me that compassion isn't a weakness. It's courage." Their peace, however, was not without challenges. With growth came new responsibilities. The community center had begun expanding, opening branches in other towns. There were partnerships to manage, funds to raise, and hundreds of people depending on them. Some nights, Stella would sit by her desk surrounded by blueprints, exhaustion heavy in her eyes. Dante, who once thrived on perfection, now found himself reminding her to rest. "The world won't fall apart if you take a break," he would say, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. She would smile faintly, recognizing the irony. Once, it had been her who reminded him of balance, and now, he had learned enough to remind her back. One rainy afternoon, as thunder rolled over the city, a delivery arrived at their door in an old, weathered box addressed to Dante in his mother's handwriting. The postmark was faded, the corners worn by time. Margaret brought it to the study, her eyes curious. "It must have been misplaced for years," she said softly before leaving them alone. Dante stared at it for a long moment, his heart pounding. With trembling hands, he opened the box. Inside was a collection of letters yellowed by age tied with a silk ribbon. The first was dated years before his mother had passed. Stella sat beside him as he unfolded the delicate paper. The handwriting was elegant and familiar. "My dearest Dante, if you are reading this, then time has carried me far from where I can guide you. You will face a world that values strength over kindness, power over peace. But promise me, my son, that you will never forget. The greatest thing a man can build is not a company or a fortune. but a legacy of love. When you find someone who reminds you of the good in yourself, hold on to them. They will be your compass when the world tries to harden you. Tears blurred his vision. For years he had tried to live up to his father's definition of success, suppressing the part of him that once believed in goodness. But his mother had seen this day long before it arrived. He turned to Stella, his voice breaking. She knew I'd lose myself trying to be what he wanted. Stella placed her hand gently over his. And she also knew you'd find your way back, she said. She believed in the man you were meant to become. That night, Dante sat alone in the library long after Stella had gone to bed, reading every letter his mother had written. Some spoke of her dreams for the world. Others were filled with small, loving advice. But the last one stopped him completely. It was shorter than the rest, almost like a whisper across time. When you find the person who brings light into your house again, remember to build something that will last beyond both of you. The next morning, Dante woke with a new sense of clarity. He went to Stella, who was already preparing lesson materials for the children. There's something I want to do, he said, his tone resolute yet tender. Something for the future. She looked up, curious. What is it? He smiled, the kind of smile that carried both peace and purpose. I want to create a foundation, one that builds learning centers across the country. Places where children from broken homes can find safety and education. We'll call it the Rosa Foundation, after your grandmother. Stella's breath caught. She hadn't expected that. Tears welled in her eyes as she remembered her grandmother's frail hand, the woman whose illness had started this entire journey. She would have been proud, she whispered. Dante brushed a tear from her cheek. She was the first reason you chose to sacrifice your dreams, he said softly. Now her name will give others theirs. And so the Rosa Foundation was born. Over the next year, it became a beacon of hope for countless families. What had begun as a forced marriage transformed into a shared mission, not bound by duty but by devotion. News outlets once again covered the story, calling it the Blackwood Miracle. The tale of a man who found redemption through compassion and a woman who turned a contract into a covenant of purpose. But behind all the admiration, what truly mattered to Stella and Dante were the lives they touched. On the first anniversary of the foundation, they hosted a gathering at the community center. The hall was filled with laughter, music, and stories of change. Children performed small plays about hope and forgiveness. Volunteers spoke of how the center had changed their lives, and elderly residents shared tears of gratitude. As the final performance ended, a young boy walked up to Dante and handed him a small clay sculpture, 2 hands holding a single light. It's you and her, the boy said simply. Dante knelt down, his throat tightening. It's beautiful, he whispered. Do you know what this light means? The boy nodded. It means you didn't give up. Later that evening, as the last of the guests departed and the lights dimmed, Dante and Stella stood on the rooftop of the center, looking out over the city. The air was cool, the stars bright against the velvet sky. Do you realize, Stella said softly, that everything we have now came from one decision made in desperation? Dante nodded. Sometimes, he said, the hardest choices lead to the most beautiful destinations. He looked at her, his gaze steady and full of quiet reverence. You were my storm, Stella, the one that broke everything I thought I was. But you were also the calm that rebuilt me. She smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. And you, she whispered, were my test. The one that taught me that love isn't just about feeling. It's about choosing, again and again, even when the world gives you reasons not to. They stood there in silence, the city lights stretching beneath them like a field of stars, the future shimmering with promise. The world had tried to break them, through pain, misunderstanding, and loss. But they had emerged stronger, not because they were perfect, but because they had learned how to rebuild from imperfection. As the wind brushed gently through Stella's hair, Dante placed his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. Tomorrow, he said softly, we start the next chapter. There's still so much to do. Stella leaned her head against his chest, smiling through quiet tears. Tomorrow, she echoed, we build again. And so, as the first light of dawn touched the horizon, the two stood together, no longer bound by contract or circumstance, but by a love that had been tested and proven, by a faith that had survived every storm, and by a legacy that would live on long after they were gone. Theirs was not a story of wealth or fame, but of transformation, a testament that even the most broken beginnings can lead to the most beautiful tomorrows when two hearts choose to rebuild, one act of compassion at a time.